Chris O'Connor here. Join the Curmudgeon Rock Report's invite-only curmudgeonly community at facebook.com/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist that pays honor to this episode.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. There are certain cities that are synonymous with rock and roll. Since the 1960s, London has continuously and consistently given us some of the best bands of all time. Since the late 1970s, Manchester has had a proud tradition of giving us some of the most cutting-edge music spanning the post-punk and indie rock spectrum. Of course, there's New York City and its rock tradition, giving us bands that range from grimy and punky to artsy and esoteric. San Francisco birthed the hippie rock scene of the 1960s, but also has its own history with punk and heavy metal. Seattle was the sun in the middle of the rock and roll solar system from the late 1980s through the mid-1990s with its all-encompassing grunge and alternative scenes. However, one can argue that no city can match Los Angeles for the depth of talent and the breadth of musical styles that have come from the City of Angels since the 1960s and continues to come out to this very day. While I would love to go on about some of the great contemporary bands that the LA area has been pumping out, this episode and the next will focus on one particular decade, the 1980s. Why is this so? Because it was during this decade, more than any other, that LA really was the center of the rock universe, and it was so in the most dichotomous of ways. On one side, you had the flamboyant, decadent, superficial, tawdry, sleazy, glam/hair metal scene that was all over rock radio and pasted all over MTV. It really was the dominant form of mainstream rock throughout the whole decade. On the other side, though, there was a defiantly underground, subterranean scene more concerned with artistic credibility and musical authenticity than girls, cars, and booze. It was a scene that, during the early 1980s, coalesced around the infectious germ of hardcore punk that was spreading in dive bars, clubs, house parties, and recreation centers in every major city in the country. But it was in Los Angeles and the Southern California area in general that this rebel form of rock found a spearhead in the form of independent label SST Records and its numerous bands that would go on to be massively influential in future subgenres such as alternative rock, indie rock, post-rock, industrial, and beyond. On this episode, we're going to focus on the first half of the 1980s, roughly the period spanning 1981 to 85, and chronicle how the LA scene transformed into a rock and roll mecca for both shameless wannabe rock stars as well as outcasts and hipsters. Welcome to Los Angeles Rocks in the 1980s, and welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
So before we get going, folks, something that I neglected to do last episode in our 1980 tribute. I forgot to mention that Clem Burke, the drummer for Blondie, recently passed away, and he's worth celebrating because he was one of the best drummers of that whole period, of that whole new wave scene. If you listen to the song "Dreaming" from Blondie, and the drumming on there, it might as well just be an octopus that's playing drums on there. It's pretty proficient. So we have to give it up for Clem Burke and Blondie. They were, one of the better bands of that era, and certainly had some of the best drumming, right, Art?
Yeah, I mean, think about Blondie in general, not just Clem Burke, the whole band. They were not three-chord punks. Nope. Like, those dudes could play. Well, Debbie Harry, yeah, she was a great singer, but she was a musician herself. And the guitarist from Blondie, who was her, not really her husband, but was her boyfriend at the time, Chris Stein, fantastic guitar player, really, really had great solos, great riffs. Just as in general, that band could play. They were really good musicians, and they were never
Yep.
really a punk band. They were a pop band with like punk sheen or punk attitude, but they were a pop band, and they were like a very talented and skilled, musicianly skilled pop band.
Yeah,
That
absolutely. And I think Burke probably exhibited the most skill of anybody. Again, you listen to Dreaming and you're hearing like grade A drumming. It's maybe not quite Bonham and Moon, but it's but as rock
yeah,
drumming goes, he was among the best, and
yeah, for
he
sure.
will definitely be missed. He was young too. He was only 7 years old.
Yeah,
Stein and Debbie Harry are both pushing 80, and so
yeah,
Burke was considerably younger
yeah,
than them. So
right.
interesting. Like the 20th century continues to die out,
Yeah,
and we're left with its remnants and left to celebrate what we can while we still can. So
right.
with that said, let us segue into our usual beginning. And oh boy, here it comes. We're crossing over into the other side of the space-time continuum and hurtling into the parallel universe, baby. It's over here where rock and roll is still predominant and still the thing, man. On the billboards, in the arenas, on the cover of Rolling Stone. Everybody's rocking till midnight, rocking till the dawn, and lighting those lighters in the arena. And it never went out of style, and it never went the way of jazz. It never went niche, and it's still the thing. And so here's where we celebrate the artists, the new and newish artists that are still making good rock and roll, that are still carrying on the torch of that spirit, and who are still giving us something new to chew on and to really whet our appetites as rock and roll heads. It's not all just about the nostalgia. I mean, that's most of what we do on this podcast, but we like to give it up for the new and newish artists too. So, Arturo, who are you covering in this episode's version of the Parallel Universe?
Well, appropriately, considering that this is an episode centering on rock music from Los Angeles, I'm reviewing not an album, but a single by LA indie rock artist Zzzahara with three Z's. She's been kicking around for a few years now, and her second album, which came out this year, titled Spiral Your Way Out, produced a spectacular single called Ghosts, whose video you can check out on YouTube. You can file this song under the following category: the best alternative rock radio hit song that the year 1996 never gave us. The electronic drum beat, the guitars that alternate between chiming and crunching, the tortured introspective lyrics, the gloriously catchy chorus. It's just a perfect nugget of 1990s inspired pop rock that manages to sound strikingly fresh and contemporary rather than retro revival kitschy. The album that it comes from is just okay. There are a few too many monotonous, same-sounding songs, as if Zzzahara is just now coming into her own as a singer-songwriter. But this cracker of a song, as well as the groovy should-be slacker anthem Bruised, serves notice that better is probably yet to come from her. Chris?
Yeah, you're probably in your right to just focus on Ghosts. It's clearly the best song on Spiral Your Way Out. Spiral Your Way Out actually is more akin to late 80s indie pop than it is anything else. It's got very reverby vocals generally, and has a little bit of an electro thing going on. But here on Ghosts,
But
it's a
Ghost
little.
is 90s.
Yeah, Ghost is very 90s. It's like something that could have been done by Primitive Radio Gods
Yeah.
or Geggy Ta
Yeah.
or a band like that. And it's
Right.
very 90s. It's very clean. It's very crisp, and it's the one song on the album where she allows her voice to really truly be heard without effects.
Right.
Where you can really clearly hear her speak singing at one point and then singing. And she's got a compelling voice. She doesn't necessarily need to hide it in all the sheen like she does otherwise.
Right.
As far as this album, two other tracks on the album that I actually like are "Head in a Wheel" and "New York, New York," or "NY, NY," which is the album closer. I can see why you focused on the single because it's by far the best song on the record, and it's by far the one that shows the most promise for her, Zzzahara. I think her full name is Zzzahara Jamie.
Yeah,
Uh,
she's from LA. She's like half Filipino, half Mexican.
yep.
Yep. So
Poor girl.
Jaime is probably if that's the name
Jaime.
because if she's
Yeah,
of Mexican descent, right?
yeah, Jaime. Yeah, she's from Highland Park, California, and yeah, I think she's got a bright future if she can write more songs like this. And
Yeah.
who knows, maybe she'll get TikTok famous. I mean
Hey,
that's kind of how it happens for indie rock artists these days. Is they have a chance to get TikTok famous if a 14-second snippet of one of their songs gets on a video that gets
right.
shared 100 million times. So
Yeah.
hey, maybe it'll be her turn. But yeah, definitely check out Ghost. It's on all the streaming services. It's on YouTube. And the album is too. Matter of fact, if you like the album more than we do, give us some fan mail at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. We always encourage that at the end of these episodes. But hey, why not interject the fan mail early in the episode? So there you go. And so moving on from there, we go in a different direction, actually a much different direction, and we're covering the latest release from Tuareg wonderkin Mdou Moctar.
Mdou Moctar. Get it right, Chris.
What did I say?
Mdel something. It's
I
Mdou Moctar.
I said Mdou. It's not. You're saying Mdou?
Yeah,
Okay, but we agree it's Moctar.
it is Moctar.
Yeah, so Mdou Moctar, and
Yeah.
he's got a new album out called Tears of Injustice. And Mokhtar has become famous over the last 6 or 7 years as one of the best guitarists in the world. And he's a firebrand, and he leads his band of it's three guys from Niger and a bassist from Brooklyn, and they comprise the band Mdou Moctar. And this album, Tears of Injustice, is really interesting. And let me explain why here. So last year, Niger's Mdou Moctar and his namesake band released the album Funeral for Justice. Much like the band's previous couple of releases, the album featured Mokhtar's furious electric guitar playing, offering up what amounted to West African desert blues as filtered through the axe of Eddie Van Halen, a personal hero of Mokhtar's. Funeral for Justice was a fiery, angry album full of protest songs that gave a spotlight to the fraught situation back in Niger, where never-ending civil war among the ongoing colonial presence of France had made it impossible for the band to return home from America. I thought the album was one of the strongest of 2024, and it placed number 8 on my end-of-the-year top 10 list. One issue that Mokhtar, the band, faces as a result of Mokhtar, the guy's guitar ingenuity and its related searing volume, however, is that the boom boom bang bang tends to obscure how strong of a band this really is, both in terms of their songwriting and also in terms of their chemistry as players together. That's why Mokhtar's latest release, A Time for Injustice, is so striking. The album is a mostly acoustic track-for-track reworking and re-recording of Funeral for Justice. Here, the percussion work of Suleiman Ibrahim and bass player Mikey and the bass playing of Mikey Colton really stand out as they accentuate the song's Tuareg-born rhythms tremendously. And while Mokhtar's playing is still dynamic, the quieter approach demonstrates how soulful, in fact, he can be. In this acoustic form, the songs are definitely more hypnotic. They're bluesier, they're meditative, and they offer up a vision of musicians in a more. The vision they offer up is of musicians in mourning, huddled around a campfire, playing only to an audience of themselves and God. The standout re-performance on the record is that of Imuhar. On Funeral for Justice, the 5-minute long song Imuhar is driven by an agile rock and roll riff by Mokhtar and a blistering slam dance friendly tempo. On A Time for Injustice, Imuhar is reimagined as a slow burning 8.5-minute long chanting folk blues number. The song benefits from the slower, more deliberate pace, which results in a higher level of emotional intensity. Album closer Modern Slaves also benefits from its new, more contemplative treatment. On Funeral for Justice, a galloping drum beat drives the protest song forward. On A Time for Injustice, rather, Again, things slow down, and here he de-emphasizes the drumming, coming close to offering up a solo work, really. As a result, this take is sadder and more crestfallen. It's a wondrously moody rendition. I'd love to hear more of this type of thing from Mdou Moctar, the band, going forward. They could potentially be the best acoustic blues band in the result if in the world. Let me start that over. They could potentially be the best acoustic band in the blues. They could potentially be the best acoustic blues band in the world if they so chose. I think after listening to this album multiple times, this is a sound I also think more befitting of the band's current exilic fate. They could turn up the awareness by toning down the proceedings, really. Check out A Time for Injustice, the best recording I've heard from anyone so far in 2025. Arturo, what's your thought?
Yeah, I really like it. It's quite good. Yeah, it's just I mean, we all know how awesome he is on electric guitar. It's refreshing to hear Mokhtar on acoustic, and he's every bit as not bombastic, but every bit
Virtuosic.
The technical master and virtuoso on acoustic as he is on electric, and it's really good. It's great. It works on several levels. You can sit down and listen to it and really admire it. It's also great background music to having sex.
Yeah. Have you tried it out?
I tried, yes.
Did it work?
Yeah.
All right. Congratulations, wifey. You've been shagged to the sounds of Tuareg.
It's good though. I like this album. I must say, Chris, this is the best album you've recommended in a while. You're in a bit of a losing streak there, but this is a good one.
Well, what, you didn't like Anxious? No, it wasn't a losing streak. Hey, for me, it's always a winning streak. For you, it might be a losing streak, but for me, it's always a winning streak, baby. But yeah, no, this is definitely the best album I've heard this year. Moctar, he is a virtuoso electric player, but he's got enough musical chops. And again, like I said, this is just a strong band. They just have a really great chemistry together. Yeah. Like I said, with that rhythm section mixed with what Moctar is doing on acoustic guitar, they put it together, and it's really just got this meditative quality, and it just grows. In some spots it grows spooky and almost celestial and transcendent in what they're doing. It's like they conjure up moods, the sort of the mournfulness of what's going on in Niger and in those Tuareg territories of Western Africa. It's they're really, really good at this type of thing, and like I said, I hope that they do more of this in the future, because Moctar the band is just as good as Moctar the guy.
Moctar.
Stop busting my balls.
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
Girls, cars, cocaine, sleaze, decadence, hairspray, leather, everything that's tacky. Just put it all together. That was the Sunset Strip mainstream LA rock scene in, throughout the entire decade of the 1980s. I can smell the sleaze now. Chris, introduce us.
Oh, none of that is tacky, motherfucker. You're tacky. Actually, yeah. What a glorious time to be alive. 45 years ago, we're taking this back, and we're starting this episode about the part one of this series on the rock of Los Angeles in the 1980s. We're focusing on the early 80s, and we're going to start with the mainstream phenomenon that came out of LA, which was the glam metal scene. And so let's talk about it. Like I said, as we said in the opener, Los Angeles hosted what proved to be the most vibrant and influential of all rock scenes overall in the 1980s. We've said there are two components to this, and it'll be my pleasure to cover the more above ground element of the LA thing, namely its storied glam metal output. Glam metal, as it was called, was a hybrid creation based on a number of sources and resources. There was the performative androgyny of bands like the New York Dolls and its lead singer, the recently departed David Johansen. There's another RIP for you.
Yeah.
There was the theatricality of Kiss and Alice Cooper. Yes, makeup and poofed up hair were very much a hook. There was the emphasis on guitar virtuosity and showiness that broke out big in the late 70s thanks to Eddie Van Halen and British metal bands like Judas Priest. There also was the particular infusion of plain old pop sensibilities, with sing-along melodies and near-falsetto, pseudo-screaming vocals being standard fare. It all formed a competitive brand of sensationalism that aimed to entertain as much as it did to rock balls, and it aimed to appeal to women as much as it did to men. For a period of about 7 years, from 1983 to 1990, glam metal became arguably the dominant form of popular music on the charts and on MTV, as a nation of would-be rockers caught up in all the moves and grooves and all those prettified, hairspray-soaked frontmen, and all those diddly-diddly-diddly-dee guitar solos. But it all started circa 1979 and 1980 in the rock clubs along Los Angeles' fabulous Sunset Strip, such as the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Starwood, the Rainbow Bar and Grill, the Roxy, and the Troubadour. Los Angeles is a city where dreams go to either flourish or die, where people move to see and be seen. It's sun and fun and glitz and glamour on one end, and excess and depravity on the other. Such is the life in the place where they make all the movies and party on the beach and beyond, but also houses a lot of really nice long-term drug rehabilitation clinics. The band and the...
Gotta go to the territory.
Yep, true enough. The bands and fans that comprised the glam metal scene, which perhaps peaked in 1984, captured the dichotomous nature of Los Angeles almost perfectly. The sexuality teemed while the self-destruction lurked. As Motley Crue singer Vince Neil put it in the band's fabulous autobiography, The Dirt, quote, "The Sunset Strip was a cesspool of depravity," end quote. The light shone brightly even as folks celebrated and reveled in the dark. It was a time to be slick while also being obnoxious. The practitioners of glam metal sought to be pretty and ribald simultaneously, and they largely succeeded. It must have been thrilling to be a part of, really. Imagine seeing Motley Crue in its earliest form, highlighted by 6'8" bassist Nikki Sixx in his platform boots and lighting himself on fire in a 150-person capacity shithole club in April of 1981. Or watching guitar maestro Randy Rhoads doing his swaggering genius guitar thing with the early incarnation of Quiet Riot in one of those dives. Or seeing Ozzy Osbourne in the early stages of his comeback finding his footing as the Prince of Darkness. Or finding kinship with other fans dressed in spandex and with black grease paint penciled below your eyes. Or doing cocaine with and possibly fucking the drummer and the bassist in a rat hole apartment after the show. Or hell, just fucking each other in the back of the club during the show. That was the nightly scene in those early days. Decadent, indulgent, raucous, sweaty, showy, over-the-top, excessive, debauched. The danger was in the lifestyle, if not the music. The heaven versus hell musings and Lord of the Rings-style mythos of early metal was largely absent from the songs, though there was plenty of sex, partying, tough guy in mascara posturing, and cheeky devil worship to make up for it. It ultimately was a hell of a party, and ultimately one that carried commercial appeal. LA's brand of glam metal proved to be among the city's most lucrative cultural exports over the course of the 1980s. The LA scene was frenzied enough in original form, however, that even British glam metal musical peers Def Leppard could barely handle it. Quoting Def Leppard singer Joe Elliott from a Sunset Strip history piece published by Rolling Stone in 2015, quote, "We were so far away from that strip mentality that we didn't even know what it was. But we put out Pyromania and we were in the States touring with Billy Squier. We had just done American Bandstand and it was leopard guitarist Steve Clark's 23rd birthday. So we went to the Rainbow, and then we invited a few people back to the Sunset Marquee where we were staying for drinks and stuff. We wound up having like 65 people trying to walk into Steve's room. It just got stupid. We had to start turning people away, and it was guys like Dio. But we had to say, dude, we can't let you in. Imagine saying that to Dio. But it was crazy. I mean, we were a band from Sheffield. We had never seen a scene like that. End quote. Viva la revolution, I suppose, right, Arturo?
Yeah. I mean, there's a great movie about this, The Decline of Western Civilization,
Yeah.
Part 2, the Penelope Spheris documentary.
Yep.
Everybody, if you want to see like a video accompaniment to what Chris just described, watch that movie.
Yep.
It really is something. They interview not just some of the major players of the LA scene. They also interview a bunch of like would-be wannabes, the ones who never quite made it, as if emphasizing the point that for all the bands that got big from the LA glam metal scene, there were a hell of a whole lot more that never made it.
Yeah,
And
but that's the story of any scene, though.
Right.
And that's what makes the scene so rich. It's the people that didn't make it, and the folks that people admired but never quite got out. Which, by the way, coincidentally, originally included Randy Rhoads.
Yeah.
Before Ozzy rescued him.
Right.
Which we'll talk about shortly.
Yeah, so yeah, if you guys want to, highly recommend that. It's just fantastic. It's a fantastic movie. I'm gonna reference her first movie, The Decline of Western Civilization Part 1, which has more to do with the LA punk scene. So Penelope Spheris really had her finger on the pulse of Los Angeles rock music.
Yeah, she really did. And
All right, so Chris, yeah. So there are four artists that we're gonna focus on from the first half of this decade, and the first one isn't really from LA, is he?
Nope. We're going to start by talking about Ozzy Osbourne as well as Randy Rhoads. So the initial breakout stars of the glam metal scene were perhaps unsurprisingly Ozzy Osbourne and his new classically trained guitarist Randy Rhoads. Osbourne had been fired from Black Sabbath in 1979, leaving him in a position to scramble for what was next. Luckily for Osbourne, he found it quickly in the clubs of LA, eventually auditioning and hiring Rhoads, a young, prodigally gifted guitarist whose initial platform came in propelling the music of Quiet Riot in the late 1970s. Blizzard of Oz, Ozzy's solo debut, was released in September of 1980. It captured the early template for LA glam metal wonderfully. Punkish riffage, chugging tempos, occasionally proggy time signature changes as on standout song Mr. Crowley, Rhoads' lead guitar pyrotechnics galore, Ozzy's screamy but sincere vocalizing, and mainstream gazing melodicism as on eternal classic rock staple but nevertheless awesome slice of pop metal Crazy Train. Blizzard of Oz sold well upon its release and over the years since has grown to be a 5 times platinum album. Ozzy, along with Rhoads, bassist Bob Daisley, and drummer Lee Kerslake still in tow, followed up Blizzard of Oz with perhaps a more storied record among metalheads in 1981, Diary of a Madman. The album is more of a showcase for Rhoads' ability as a lead player, which at its highest points competed with Eddie Van Halen in terms of scale pattern, virtuosity, and raw power. See especially Rhoads' absolute shredding jobs on the single Flying High Again and the spookily lurking title track. Diary of a Madman went on to sell more than 3 million copies. Sadly, the magical Ozzy and Rhoads collaboration was cut short when Rhoads died in a plane crash on March 19th, 1982. Pretty bad incident. Basically, him and a pilot went joyriding while they were on tour with Ozzy, and they went to buzz the tour bus and accidentally crashed into the tour bus.
Wow.
And went into a ball of flame and into the concrete and died. Yikes. Legend has it that Rhoads may have been on the verge of quitting on Ozzy over the latter's drinking and drug abuse, so perhaps things may have not gone on too much longer, or perhaps Rhoads would reemerge on later records in a one-off fashion. No matter, the work he left behind on Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman made him a legend and set forth a musical standard that Ozzy Osbourne spent the next 4+ decades chasing but never reclaiming. Rhoads, with his preferences for minor keys and twisty-bendy song structures, effectively reinvented metal and set the table for the star bands that followed in his wake. Arturo, what do you say about Ozzy and his early output?
Um, the only good music, as far as I'm concerned, that Ozzy Osbourne ever did was with Black Sabbath. But, however, I will acknowledge that Randy Rhoads was a fantastic guitar player. The dude was amazing. Go watching some old YouTube clips. He was very much on par with Eddie Van Halen. And I say that on purpose because there was a little tiny bit of bad blood on Eddie Van Halen's part. He kind of thought Randy Rhoads ripped him off a
Yeah.
bit. And
Well, everybody ripped off Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen, is the one that came up with all that scale pattern shit,
yeah,
and
true.
double tapping.
Yeah,
So
but
he was the
really
innovator.
he really did single out Randy Rhoads though, and Rhoads, to his credit, never really responded badly. This is a quote that he did in an 1982 interview with Guitar World shortly before he died, actually. Quote. Let's see, what did he say here? Okay, for instance, I do a solo guitar thing in concert, and I do a lot of the same licks as Eddie Van Halen. Eddie is a great player, but it kills me that I do that. Kind of hinting that he kind of really doesn't want to play rock and roll that much.
Yeah.
Because Randy Rhoads was classically trained, and that
Yeah,
was
and he
obsession.
wanted to go back to school for classical guitar.
Yeah, he wanted to be a modern classical composer. That was his dream. But anyway, I'll continue with the quote. Quote, for me, it's just flash that impresses the kids. I'm trying to make a name for myself as fast as I can. I wish I could take time and come up with something that nobody else has done, but that's going to take a few years yet. Okay. And then Eddie, I guess, echoing a similar perspective, basically he talked about Randy Rhoads saying, quote, he was good, he said at the time in 1982. This is shortly after Randy Rhoads died. They interviewed Eddie. He was good, but I don't think he really did anything that I haven't done. There ain't nothing wrong with it, man. I've copied other people, end quote. So thanks, Eddie.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what a tribute. What a loving tribute. Yeah, but no, yeah, Rhoads really was special. I mean, just like if you listen to the song "I Don't Know" off of Blizzard of Oz, where he plays both rhythm and lead, and just some of the riffage and some of the angularity that he comes up with on that song. It's just it's pretty extraordinary. And you got to remember, he started out with a band, and we've already mentioned him, and they went on to become one of the more curiously fascinating stories in all of metal, and that was Quiet Riot.
Oh boy!
And so let's talk about Quiet Riot next.
Yeah.
So as we've said, Rhoads got his start as the co-founder of Quiet Riot, which was formed all the way back in 1973. Quiet Riot was definitely no instant success. Actually, in its first incarnation, it toiled in the LA scene for years. Rhoads' local buzz couldn't translate into any type of mainstream success. The never-ending grind prompted Rhoads to leave the band in 1979 in order to become a member of Ozzy Osbourne's first band as a solo artist. Indicative of the difficulties that the band had, its first two albums, Quiet Riot and Quiet Riot 2, were released in Japan only in the 1970s. They couldn't even get American distribution. That's how bad it was. After Rhoads' departure, the band actually broke up for 2 years before co-founding vocalist Kevin DuBrow decided to give it another go in 1982. And I'm sure he's thankful that he did. Reuniting with bandmate Rudy Sarzo, who was the bassist in the first version of Quiet Riot, who had also worked with Ozzy Osbourne following Quiet Riot's breakup, and also bringing in guitarist Carlos Cavazo and drummer Frankie Banali, the reformed Quiet Riot caught fire in the burgeoning Los Angeles glam metal scene, and by the end of 1982, the band had signed a record deal with CBS Records. Quiet Riot then released the album Metal Health in 1983. The album, of course, features none of the virtuoso virtues that Rhoads presented in the earlier incarnation, and is a grade C plotter overall. Ironically, Quiet Riot was doing a cheap, insipid knockoff of their former bandmates' stylings working for Ozzy Osbourne. But what Metal Health did feature was DuBrow's charisma and chops as a heavy metal frontman. DuBrow was a screamer of the highest order, and he knew that the dumber the song and the worse the attitude, the more fun it could be if you played it with enough panache. Hell, the most dramatic cinema-worthy piece of music on Metal Health is the lilting intro to a song called Love's a Bitch. Nope, this version of Quiet Riot wasn't out to revolutionize music. And nope, and yep, Dubrow was in it for the plain dumb fun. Dubrow also had good taste in cover tunes, which allowed Quiet Riot to become the first breakout glam metal superstars of the MTV era. Quiet Riot's swaggering, schmaltzy cover of Slade's 1973 rocker Come On Feel the Noise, I'm sure you all know their version, became a huge hit, reaching number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart and staying there for 5 straight weeks in the summer of 1983. The music video for the song also remained in heavy rotation on MTV for well over a year. Metal Health, which also featured a thumping riff-tastic title track, benefited from the profile of Come On Feel the Noise, reaching number 1 on the Billboard 200 albums chart, and in the process becoming the first metal album ever to accomplish that feat. Amazingly enough, Quiet Riot's Metal Health was the first number 1 metal album. If LA metal and its spandex-laden excesses needed a poster child, it now had one in Kevin Dubrow and Quiet Riot, and a host of other LA glam metal bands, including Motley Crue and Rockin, broke big soon afterwards. The band followed Metal Health with a virtual repeat called Condition Critical in 1984. Sticking to the formula it had derived so faithfully, there was even another Slade cover. This time, it was Mama, We're All Crazy Now. Both the album and single failed to reach the heights of the previous year, however, and a steady decline followed, culminating in the firing of the mercurial Dubrow in 1987. Yep, the guy who went all the way back to the beginning and restarted the whole shebang was axed from his own band. Geesh, what an unsufferable asshole he must have been. But as much as anyone, the resurrected Quiet Riot and Kevin Dubrow deserve a lot of the credit for mainstreaming the LA glam metal scene through its use of MTV-ready imagery and the kinds of riffs that Rhoads and also Motley Crue had perfected in prior years. They captured the zeitgeist of the scene and helped make it a national movement. Their ambition trumped their musical abilities many times over, but that's a forgivable sin, seeing how much fun and mirth and merriment they unleashed on the world back in the 1980s. Arturo?
Yeah, my take on Quiet Riot and their one hit, which they really had only one hit, is this. The sun shines on a dog's ass every now and then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Quiet Riot. The song that they hit big with, Come On Feel the Noise, that cover, they didn't want to do it, actually, from what I read. It was kind of forced upon them by their manager. That kind of says something when your own manager doesn't have faith in your own material.
Yeah.
That he wants you to do a cover, and hey, it hit big. Good for them. Here's the thing. Neither their version nor Slade's version of Come On Feel the Noise is the best version. Do you know which is the best version?
Oasis
from 1996, the B-side to Don't Look Back in Anger. By far the best version of Come On Feel the Noise. I recommend everyone go on Spotify or YouTube and look it up.
I still prefer this version.
Really?
This version is so schmaltzy and so over the top that I love it.
Yeah, but the Oasis version, it has a different feel. It's more like it's more
anthemic.
It's more anthemic. It makes you want to believe in rock and roll. There's a desperation to it, and for a band known as a Britpop band, it kind of has kind of a grungy groove.
Yeah, but the Quiet Riot version has kind of a Vegas quality to it.
God, that's not a compliment.
No, but that's what I love about it. It's just the swinging fury of Vegas, and it's pretty good. Like I said, Quiet Riot's story is interesting in the sense that they toiled there in the '70s, got a lot of respect. They were like we talked about, like any scene, and they were very early on. They were peers with Van Halen actually.
Yeah.
So that kind of describes why Eddie Van Halen would be competitive with Randy Rhoads, because they were kind of the main competitors within that early.
Right.
That wasn't really even glam metal. They were more the earlier version of Quiet Riot was more prog metal because of Rhoads' virtuosity, and so they were a pretty good band. And then from there, like I said, Dubrow understood that there was some fondness for the old Quiet Riot, and metal was all of a sudden was starting to get big, and he came back and really caught the zeitgeist right at the right time. So in some ways, opportunism is what birthed the second version of Quiet Riot more than anything. And
Right.
so it was, say what you want about opportunism, but they played their cards well, and they became a huge, huge band. And without Come On Feel the Noise, you might not get as much of the metal that went mainstream in its wake.
Right, right. Okay, next, Chris. Probably the biggest of these bands,
Yeah,
Motley Crue.
Motley effing Crue. Yes. Now, there's no debating that the most famous and perhaps the most seminal band to come out of the LA glam metal scene was Motley Crue. Both musically and reputationally, they represent the sleazy energy of the Sunset Strip. Their lifestyle was filled to the brim with women and drugs, and not necessarily in that order. Here's an amusing story from that Rolling Stone article from 2015, this coming from Nikki Sixx. Quote, did I tell you about the time I tied a girl up in the whiskey bathroom with Mick Mars' guitar cable and then went to get a bump of blow from Tommy? I forgot she was in there. I think Vince found her and everything was fine. Ought to be in Motley Crue in 1981 in Los Angeles. End quote. Consequently, the Crue's survival of all the excess and depravity, which included a few overdoses and a group trip to rehab in 1988, is almost as legendary as the excess and depravity itself. Yet here's something that non-fans of the band and what the lifestyle signified are reluctant to admit. Motley Crue is a really good band. They were performance artists first and foremost, starting out as glammed out aliens with a fire show and morphing into a leather and chains androgynous biker aesthetic by the late 1980s. But they also routinely wrote really good heavy metal songs, with guitarist Mick Mars and drummer Tommy Lee driving the proceedings with powerful athletic playing, and singer Vince Neil playing the ultra cool frontman with his growling vocals. The band's first two albums, Too Fast for Love and Shout at the Devil, pick up where Ozzy and Randy left off and offer up a tighter, louder, faster version of glam metal. Songs like Live Wire and Looks That Kill contain some of the best metal riffs ever laid down on tape. Seriously, those first two albums are inspirationally rocking affairs. The returns, of course, diminished from there into stripper anthems and dumb love ballads, but Crue's flair and good-natured rip and roar managed to still carry the day. So how did it all start for Motley Crue? Well, Tommy Lee, who had been in the scene for some time, was enamored with a band on the scene called London, which featured a super tall, super charismatic, ultra cool looking bassist named Nikki Sixx. After some prodding and a little self-destruction by London, Sixx agreed to join with Lee early in 1981. The two found guitarist Mars through placing an ad in local trade newspapers, and Lee eventually convinced high school classmate Vince Neil, then singing for a band called Rock Candy, to come on board as the new band's singer. The new band, still unnamed, played its first gig at the Starwood on April 24th, 1981. Mars suggested the band name Motley Crue, and the band styled the name with umlauts above the O in Motley and the U in the oddly spelled Crew in an homage to the beer Lowenbrow. Motley, yeah, true story. Motley Crue's following grew quickly, and its apartment, which was located a stone's throw from the Whiskey A Go-Go, became a go-to spot for debauchery, sexy time antics, and other partied-out chicanery within the scene. The band recorded Too Fast for Love in the fall of 1981 and released their album that November. Motley Crue's rising profile convinced Elektra Records to sign the band in spring of 1982. Once Quiet Riot's success opened the door for scores of LA metal bands, Crue gladly walked through that door, and Shout at the Devil ended up selling 200,000 copies in its first 2 weeks of release and got the band airplay on MTV. That in turn set forth its course as one of the biggest bands in the world over the following 8 years. Shout at the Devil and follow-ups Theater of Pain, Girls, 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 and Dr. Feelgood all went on to sell millions of records. So that's Motley Crue, forever the poster boys for this whole LA glam metal thing, for much better or for much worse. Arturo?
Much, much worse. I will say this, though. There's a great book that the four members of the band wrote themselves.
Yes, The Dirt.
It's called The Dirt, Confessions of the World's Most Notorious Rock Band, Really good. Nikki Sixx actually is a pretty darn good writer of prose, of just documenting things. He has a flair for writing. I think I think his prose writing's better than his songwriting, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
for what it's worth, that book was ghostwritten by a guy named Neil Strauss,
Also,
who's
so Nikki Sixx didn't write any of that stuff.
I mean, they might have wrote first draft, but Strauss is the one that put it together into the compelling narrative and cleaned it up.
Okay. Okay.
And
Well.
so he basically ghost wrote it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
So there you go. So that's why it's good.
but Six's stuff, but yeah, he captures Six's voice. Six is a smart guy. If you ever listen to, he's got a radio show. If you ever listen to it, he's pretty glib.
Yeah.
And you're right. They do capture Six's glibness in that book
Yeah.
for sure.
And that book was made into a biopic on Netflix in 2019, which really is a much, 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 much tamed down, toned down version of the book.
Yeah.
Which is kind of why the movie sucked. Like if I want to see a biopic on Motley Crue, I want to see the sleaze. I want to see the sex and the drugs and all the horrible shit that went on.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. I don't want anything watered down. I want to see Tommy Lee fucking that fat chick on the floor of the Motley house just so he can have access to her car. So he was fucking this fat chick just so he could drive her. She owned like a Jaguar or something, like some cool car. And so this fat chick let Tommy Lee fuck her so that and then gave him permission to use her car. So
this is before Motley Crue made it, before they got their record.
big. Yeah, this was when they were still in the Motley house. That's what they called their apartment around the corner from the whiskey. So yeah, it just real debauched, real crazy stuff that went on. So yeah, they were true blue dirtbags.
Right. They were, but hey, the book is really good. I recommend that book anybody who's listening, that's one of the best, that's one of the best rock biography books out there. So,
Yeah, no,
all
yeah,
right.
it is really good.
So Chris, next, the one
Okay.
band that took this Motley Crue, they watered down Motley Crue's sound and they got a big hit out of it. Ratt.
Yes, they did. Let's talk about Ratt. Much like Quiet Riot, Ratt had been around for quite a while before getting its big break in 1984. The band dates back to the late 1970s when band leader Stephen Pearcy co-founded predecessor band Crystal Pistol in San Diego. Crystal Pistol changed its name first to Mickey Ratt in 1977, followed shortly thereafter by just Ratt. The band, riding the growing glam metal wave, moved to Los Angeles in 1981 and became a staple of club shows on the Strip, eventually becoming the house band at the club Gazzarri's. Funny quote from Stephen Pearcy taken from that Rolling Stone piece on the LA scene. Quote, I saw so many people fuck on the lawns behind Gazzarri's that I actually got bored of watching and started throwing empty beer cans at them. End quote. The band built the cult following, which fueled its self-released, self-titled debut EP to sell an impressive 100,000 copies plus. Ratt's music was poppier, hookier, and more deliberately commercial than many of the other bands in the glam metal scene. Ram also wasn't as beholden to heavy metal gimmickry and convention as others. Remember, even the mighty Motley Crue broke out with a single called Shout at the Devil,
Yeah.
So by 1984, with Quiet Riot, Motley Crue, and Wasp and Dokken and several other bands broken out into the mainstream, Ratt was ready for its own turn in the limelight. Their first full-length album, Out of the Cellar, was released in 1984. Fueled by the heavy MTV airplay gained by the video to the sing-songy pop metal gem Round and Round, the video featured their manager's uncle dressed in drag. Maybe you've heard of him, comedian Milton Berle. Out of the Cellar went on to sell more than 3 million copies. Round and Round reached number 12 on the Billboard 100. The follow-up single to Round and Round, Out for More, was even swingier and poppier. It's not an understatement to say that Out of the Cellar was a stellar forerunner to all of the much crappier Poisons and Warrants that came out of LA during glam metal's second wave a few years later, something we'll cover on a future episode. Effectively, Ratt was Bon Jovi before Bon Jovi was Bon Jovi. Out of the Cellar was followed by 1987's Invasion of Your Privacy, which also went platinum and was also stocked with pop metal bubblegum. Subsequent efforts in the years that followed to gain a harder edge and produce a more purely metallic creation were less commercially successful, and Ratt fell into obscurity by the end of the 1980s. But before then, Ratt was an essential component of the LA scene, pumping up the glamour and the flavor that became the music's general hallmark. And Round lives on in classic rock glory to this day. In fact, I just heard it in the car earlier this week, and of course, I sang along and smiled. Art?
Yeah, Rat. This is even shitty bands have one good song in them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is one. Yeah, it's a great song. Round and Round is it's hooky, it's catchy. It's glam metal. It's more like pop metal, if anything.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great track, and even I have it in my 1984 playlist compilation.
Yep. Yeah, I was going to say, although I personally I think Out for More is a better song. And that got a lot of play. I remember that song because that actually was a modest hit. It didn't reach number 12, but it got pretty popular, and it was a better song, even hookier. But Round and Round, just like I said, it was the video. It was Milton Berle.
Yeah, I know
that helped sell Ratt. Go figure.
Milton Berle and his notoriously large penis.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's true. You read stories about him. Apparently, the dude had the biggest cock in the world.
Yeah, but he was dressed up in drag. He was his Uncle Milty character, which was a drag queen, and he shows up in that video. And like I said, it turns out his nephew was Ratt's manager. There you go. It pays to have a celebrity on speed dial,
right?
And it definitely helped their cause. So that's kind of a core four. Ozzy and Randy Rhoads, Quiet Riot, Motley Crue and Ratt. There's other bands we could talk about. There's Wasp with Blackie Lawless and throwing meat out into the crowd. There's Dokken. And then you get the second wave, which we'll talk about in the second subsequent episode, which is Poison and Guns N' Roses and Warrant and LA Guns and
right.
Driving and Crying and
Winger.
more of those. And Winger. Yeah, yeah, and more of those bands. So more to come, but effectively it was these early bands that set the tone for everything. And by 1984, like I said, you go down there and it's like, all those bands and all those artists, walking, like you could go to the grocery store during the day out on the Sunset Strip, and it was like full of metal dudes, with long hair and mascara and tattoos and shit.
Putting up posters on walls. Come see our band tonight.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it was. It was flyer heaven back then. That you're only as good as many flyers as you could put out for your show.
Yeah.
For the upcoming weekend. So I will say this: those bands probably worked harder than any other bands that ever existed.
A lot of them were hard workers, and very few of them were actually from Los Angeles.
Yeah. Oh, I know. They all kind of. Motley Crue was like the one band that was fully from L.A.
And half of Guns N' Roses,
Yeah, and half of Guns N' Roses, but not Bill Bailey. He came in from Indiana.
Yeah.
Yeah, but fascinating scene, fascinating story. Like Artie mentioned, if you can see, the Western Civilization movie. Definitely see that. There's a lot of fun stuff, a lot of funny stuff in that movie. So dig it.
On this episode, we dissected the Los Angeles rock music scene in the first half of the 1980s. For the next episode, we're concluding this miniseries as we'll dissect the LA rock scene in the second half of the 80s. Glam/hair metal is now big time in the mainstream of music consumption for the public, as its sleazy, bloated, indulgent, super macho ways are all over rock radio and MTV. Chris will walk us through Motley Crue's ascendance to arena rock gods, the infiltration of second-rate bands such as Poison and Warrant, and the meteoric rise of a band who got so big so fast they almost killed the scene itself, Guns N' Roses. I, on the other hand, will tackle the underground of LA rock, as two visionary bands dominate the alternative scene in the second half of the decade, the Red Hot Chili Peppers and Jane's Addiction. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Los Angeles Rocks in the 1980s, Part 2.
Okay, so we've talked about the glam metal scene of LA in the early '80s and how it debauched, and it was dumb, but it was fun, and it was in its own silly way glorious. Now let's get into the less publicized aspect of the LA scene in the early '80s, and that was its underground. It actually was a really fertile scene for punk bands and for punk music, and some of the most adventurous punk music that ever emerged from the U.S. came out of the LA scene of the 1980s, marked as it was by SST Records and by some of the artists that Arturo will be describing. So, Arturo, let's get into this. Tell us a little bit about this underground scene and what made it so special in LA between
Yeah,
81 and 85.
right. As we established earlier in this episode, I'm taking the lead in covering the underground indie slash alternative rock scene in LA during this pivotal time of the decade in the first half of the 1980s. Now, those of you with modern ears and sensibilities will ask, what do you mean? Alternative rock and indie rock are two separate subgenres. Well, in this period that we're talking about, specifically the early to mid 80s, they really were the same thing. Underground, alternative, indie in quotation marks. These all referred to rock music that wasn't on major record labels, but was instead on smaller independent record labels. Remember, this is the time of physical media, vinyl records, cassettes, later on CDs. Those terms also referred to rock music that at the time wasn't on commercial or corporate rock radio or MTV, unless, with the latter, it was on at obscenely late hours with only stoners watching. As far as the former, if you liked radio at the time, you would only hear this kind of rock on college radio stations. As far as talking about Los Angeles rock, please keep in mind that this isn't discussing just LA specifically. This is discussing the greater LA metropolitan area and the suburbs, as is especially true with the first two bands I will eventually discuss. The thing to understand is that punk rock, the true defiantly anti-establishment style of rock of the 1970s, took longer to take hold in and spread throughout North America than it did in the UK or Europe, for that matter. When I say that, I mean it essentially took the Ramones, whose first album came out in 1976, a few years of touring up and down, east and west, all over the continent for the seeds of punk rock scenes that they planted in every major city to grow into full-blown scenes that, by the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, were self-sufficient, truly independent, and well-networked with other punk slash alternative slash indie scenes throughout the US and Canada. That last part about networking is really important. The Ramones and a handful of other like-minded national touring bands gave sympathetic artists in these cities and towns the inspiration to grow and develop their own punk and alternative sounding bands. In turn, this enthusiasm by both musicians and fans alike would result in local citywide networks of venues such as clubs, bars, house parties, and community and recreation centers for bands to play in. These citywide networks would quickly morph into statewide networks, then regional networks, then eventually a massive underground DIY network of small concert venues that would range from the dingiest of nightclubs to the most unconventional of performing spaces. Before you knew it, each major city in the country had independent fanzines. Yes, physical media in the form of cheap printed periodicals that served their respective scenes and told music lovers where to go to see bands, what cool new independent records were out, and so on. These fanzines were usually sold at locally owned independent record stores. Of course, these independent scenes in general, depending on what city they were in, were usually supported by local universities and college campuses and their respective radio stations. Depending on where you were in the country, if your radio had powerful reception to the far left of the radio dial, you had a treasure trove of independent slash college stations to pick from in order to hear all this elusive, exotic underground music. If the network of venues was the lifeblood of the American indie alternative underground, and the independent fanzines and college radio stations were its public relations clarion call, then the independent record labels themselves were the exposure platforms. Yes, independent record labels have existed since the dawn of recorded music, but the transition period of the 1970s to the 80s was the first time so many indie labels popped up all over the country, specifically centered around so many bands and artists inspired, influenced, and informed by the punk rock germ that was originally inseminated in 1976. For people with modern sensibilities, the fact that all this was done in a pre-internet age must be truly astonishing.
Yeah, it really
but
is.
Yet, here we are in the 1980s, and during this time, the best of American rock music, and Canadian as well, was to be found in this ecosystem. However, let's track back to those indie labels. At the beginning of the 1980s, many, if not most, of these indie labels reflected the alternative music scene of the cities they originated from. These scenes, in general, tended to coalesce around a distinctly American-flavored version of punk called hardcore punk rock. Essentially, this corrosive, uber-aggressive form of punk took the orthodox punk sounds of the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and made them faster, as in light speed, harder, angrier, relentless in its attack, and sometimes even resulting in violence at concerts, which drew even more violence from the police authorities called in to deal with these supposed hoodlums. Take, for example, Washington, D.C.'s Discord Records, started and founded by Ian MacKaye, the lead singer of seminal hardcore band Minor Threat. For sure, hardcore punk was Discord's original focus, music by bands and fans for bands and fans, but Discord's roster and palette of sounds would soon diversify to include the early emo punk of Rites of Spring, and eventually, and most notably, MacKaye's second band, the legendary Fugazi, and its sophisticated, complex, post-hardcore sound. In Chicago, you had Corey Rusk's Touch and Go Records, famous for eagerly going beyond hardcore punk's boundaries to show how eclectic the American underground rock scene really was. Throughout the 1980s, Touch and Go would feature the proto-industrial electro rock of Steve Albini's Big Black, the truly twisted avant-garde art rock of the Butthole Surfers, the grinding noise rock of Scratch Acid, who would morph into the pulverizing sound of the Jesus Lizard, and of course, the pioneering post-rock of Slint. Later on in the 1980s, Seattle would see the birth of Sub Pop Records, which at the beginning would be the home base of and the forefront label for the mind-bending fusion of punk, metal, and classic 70s rock known as grunge. But for most of the 1980s, the most respected, most revered, most dominant, most successful, most loaded with awesome bands label was Southern California's SST Records, founded and still run to this day by Greg Ginn, the songwriter, guitarist, and overall mastermind of perhaps hardcore punk's greatest and most important band, Black Flag. We'll get into Black Flag soon enough, but the story and importance of SST in regard to the Los Angeles music scene and the greater LA area's music scene in general needs to be discussed and understood. Born in Tucson, Arizona, Ginn grew up in Hermosa Beach, a Los Angeles suburb. In 1966, when he was 12 years old, yes, just 12 years old, Ginn started a small mail-order company called Solid State Tuners, SST for short, that sold modified radio equipment. It's a testament to Ginn's precocious acumen and intelligence that this business did well enough to thrive on a small scale and sustain Ginn up to his mid-20s. He played guitar throughout his teen years and into adulthood, becoming an avid fan of jazz music as well as being a huge Grateful Dead fan. In fact, after he graduated high school, he used his SST earnings to support himself while following the Dead on tour for about a year. Yes, he was a deadhead. In 1976, he was blown away by seeing the Ramones at a club show in the LA area, and at the old by rock standards age of 22, he decided to form his own punk rock band called Panic. They beat around for a couple of years with, unsurprisingly, no major label interest, with only small LA-based label Bump Records expressing a desire to sign them. Ever the industrious, small level entrepreneur, Ginn figured he had learned enough about business by then through his small radio parts company that he could finance studio time, produce and release a record of his band's music by himself. And that he did in early 1979 when his band, now renamed Black Flag, put out their debut EP, Nervous Breakdown, on a small indie label called, you guessed it, SST. This release, as well as Black Flag's powerful and riotous live shows, sent shockwaves throughout Southern California's then fledgling underground music scene. It inspired Ginn to take SST into a broader direction and not just as a platform for Black Flag's music. He soon recruited other local punk bands to have their music recorded and released by SST. Within a few years, thanks to a combination of word-of-mouth buzz, independent fanzine promotion, and the very important national network of live venues supporting the now thriving underground rock music scene, SST was just successful enough to recruit bands from all over the country. The roster of bands SST had throughout the decade is truly staggering. It reads like a who's who of some of the most pioneering and influential bands in the history of alternative and indie rock music. Aside from Black Flag, the label at different times released records by the likes of Bad Brains, Husker Du, the Minutemen, the Meat Puppets, Sonic Youth, Dinosaur Jr., and Soundgarden. You wouldn't make that much money on SST. In fact, every band that had a modicum of success would then go on to sign a major label or sign with a bigger indie label. But being on SST meant you had a cachet of coolness and authenticity that money couldn't buy. Before I launch into some of the seminal underground bands of the 80s LA, and not just on SST, Chris, how does it feel to cross over from the Sunset Strip and take a glance at the real wild side of the Southern California rock music scene?
Yeah, in some ways it's exhilarating because, there was a lot of DIY-ness that went to promoting and getting yourself in those clubs on the Sunset Strip. But here you're talking like, you're talking like roller rinks, and you're talking, like real sort of non-traditional venues, and you're talking
community centers,
recreation
centers,
and here
churches.
But you're talking like more networking, and you're talking about radio, and you're talking about word of mouth, and you're talking about those record stores and fanzines, and forming labels and getting that kind of buzz that traveled up and down coasts and things like that. So there's an inspiring DIY-ness to hear. Like you said, the SST roster by like 1987 was ridiculous. With Soundgarden and Husker Du, the Meat Puppets, and like bands like that. And it's like this one guy from LA who was the leader of Black Flag, was able to have enough cachet to have those bands in that roster. I mean, talk about a real prestige thing. It's like the prestige of making no money. Like I said, maybe they were marginally successful. Enough to keep SSDs, the lights on at SST, but it's not like any of these bands got rich off SST. But it was, the fact that they were among like these peers and it all meant something. And, was really kind of indicative of the underground, especially in the western half of the United States. Because a lot of those bands you mentioned, like Meat Puppets are Phoenix, Husker Du is Minneapolis, Soundgarden is Seattle. Dinosaur Jr. is Boston.
Well, Massachusetts, but I guess Boston was their base. But
yeah, Massachusetts.
Sonic Youth, New York.
Yeah, exactly. So it did spread far and wide, but a lot of it was like western half of the United States. So pretty impressive stuff from Greg Ginn, and but that wasn't the only thing that was impressive about Greg Ginn. He had arguably, at least in the first half or the first part of SST's history, he had the best band he was in, and he was the impresario of the best band on SST there
Yeah.
for a stretch, right?
Yeah, totally. But before we get into them, before we start our focus on the bands that we think are the most important of LA's underground indie alternative scene during the 1980s first half, let's give a shout out to a few other contemporary bands that deserve mention.
Okay.
First, there's Bad Religion. Like with Black Flag and Greg Ginn, guitarist Brett Gurewitz started indie label Epitaph Records as a way to self-release his hardcore punk band's music, starting with their very first EP in 1981. Since then, Bad Religion has been a mainstay of the LA punk community and a bedrock of American punk in general, even when they spent a brief period on major label Atlantic in the mid to late 1990s, getting their biggest exposure when they opened for Pearl Jam on Pearl Jam's 1995 tour. Epitaph still exists to this day as a vibrant indie label, dabbling in all kinds of music while keeping the flame for punk rock very much alive, as does the band itself, with lead singer Greg Graffin being the only consistent member. Second, there are the Circle Jerks. I mentioned how Black Flag's first EP, Nervous Breakdown, came out in 1979. The lead singer for that iteration of the band was Ginn's fellow Hermosa Beach native Keith Morris, who left Black Flag later that year to form his own hardcore punk band, this time with a decidedly wacko, Dead Kennedys-esque sense of humor. Seriously, check out their classic debut album from 1980, Group Sex, for song titles such as I Just Want Some Skank and World Up My Ass. They initially, great song title. They initially disbanded in 1987 after releasing 5 albums, but have had numerous hiatuses and reunions throughout the years and decades, even up to now with an appearance at this year's Coachella Festival. Third, and finally, there is the band Fear. Along with Black Flag, Fear is the other band credited with shaping the sound, attitude, and style of Southern California hardcore punk. 4 years older than Greg Ginn, lead singer, guitarist, and songwriter Lee Ving also worked as an actor in various movies throughout the 1980s and 90s. To this day, he's also the band's only consistent member. Think of Fear as the lowbrow, knucklehead alternative to Black Flag's quasi-intellectual aspersions and musical diversity. Their peak period with their classic lineup lasted from 1978 to 82. While afterward, they only managed to release roughly 1 album per decade, they've remained a consistent touring and working band. Their most memorable contributions to the punk history timeline are the gloriously raunchy 1978 single I Love Livin' in the City and the standalone 1982 holiday season single Fuck Christmas. Chris?
Yeah, gotta love Fuck Christmas. Yeah, no, like I said, yeah, Circle Jerks, good band. Bad Religion, great band. I was into Bad Religion when they had their mainstream period back in the 90s. So yeah, it was a vibrant scene, and those are some vibrant bands. And Fear being among those as well. I mean, Circle Jerks is interesting because, like you said, they're an outgrowth of Black Flag, and it's a little bit edgier, a little bit.
Just, they were goofier.
Yeah, they were dumber.
On.
They were
the
edgier
world
and
up
dumber.
my ass. What kind of
world up my ass. Yeah, it said they were gleefully dumber than Black Flag, but they had their own edginess to them. So those are some good bands. So good to focus on those.
All right, now the main event. The bands, in my opinion, the 4 main bands of the first half of LA's underground scene in the 1980s. Black Flag. I mentioned how future Circle Jerks frontman Keith Morris was Black Flag's original singer and performed on their debut 1979 EP Nervous Breakdown. Their second singer, Puerto Rican native Ron Reyes, didn't quite have Morris's manic stage presence or menacing vocals, but he did a good enough job on the band's searing second EP, 1980's Jealous Again. By this point, Black Flag shows were becoming notorious for not just the band's intense performances that matched their high-speed high-speed, ferocious punk rock. Their audiences were increasingly riotous, wild, and aggressive, with escalating violence at shows, sometimes drawing attention from the authorities. In fact, this was the main reason for Reyes leaving the band after just less than a year. Starting in 1981, enter a 20-year-old misfit punker and Haagen-Dazs ice cream shop employee from Washington, D.C. named Henry Rollins. He would go from just being another one in the line of Black Flag lead singers to becoming one of the most legendary, notorious, and downright charismatic frontmen in the history of punk rock. Having never written a song during his time with the band until their breakup, he nevertheless... he co-wrote some song. I'm lying there. He did write some songs.
Yeah, he co-wrote a few songs on My War.
Yeah, toward the end. Yeah, toward the end, he was writing stuff. But still, Greg Ginn wrote the most of the stuff. And he nevertheless imbued Greg Ginn's songs with a ravenous intensity, an authentically seething rage, and an even menacingly confrontational performing style that really had to be seen to believe. Thankfully, there are dozens of YouTube videos of vintage Black Flag live shows that attest to this fact. The combination of this napalm bomb of a frontman with the band's increasingly musical dexterity, as well as Ginn's developing complexity, in a good way, with his songwriting, resulted in a perfect storm of an artistic explosion that best documented in their seminal 1981 album Damaged. Never again mere three-chord punks. The album found Black Flag incorporating odd time signatures held down by a jazzy swing in the song's rhythms. Ginn's guitar had the loudness and franticness, really, of the best punk rock, but the chord progressions were exhilaratingly unpredictable, if not unorthodox. And there were blazing solos up and down the fretboard that owed as much to jazz as it did to heavy metal. And of course, there are the anguished, psychotic vocals and overall simmering with bile presence of Rollins himself, belying the mellow, laconic, laid-back Southern California nature of the tall, lanky guitarist who gave birth to these songs. Since then and until now, there has never been a punk rock record with so much visceral power, cathartic release, tortured rage, and a near pathological obsession with self-reflection and, at times, self-loathing. Seriously, find anyone in their 20s or even their 30s now and ask them about punk rock. What will they tell you? Green Day, Blink-182, any of the litany of emo punk or skate punk bands that graced the stages of the Vans Warped Tour in the first decades of this century. Play them Black Flag's Damaged in its entirety, and those alleged punk fans will walk away suffering from PTSD. The album launched Black Flag's popularity, or better yet, notoriety, from beyond their local Southern California scene to a national level, at least on a distinctly non-commercial, non-mainstream, underground national level, attracting and scaring both fans and critics alike. Financial troubles would curb the band's momentum, though. At the same time, SST Records had a distribution deal with Unicorn Records, a subsidiary of MCA. While head honchos at MCA stated that their reason to place limitations on the record's distribution was due to the controversy the band courted everywhere they went and how the album itself was a supposedly quote-unquote anti-parent album. Yeah. In later years, multiple people within Black Flag and SST Circle would say the real reason for the distribution issues was due to how poorly managed and cash-strapped Unicorn was, and that giving the album a fair, widespread distribution meant Unicorn stood to lose money, no matter what the content or the reputation of the band and record. Regardless, a huge, lengthy legal dispute followed in which Black Flag weren't allowed to record under their own name for a couple of years. What was the response to this turmoil by this most stubborn and DIY of bands? It was to tour the living shit out of themselves, out of their growing legion of fans, and out of the underground network of venues, and out of the U.S. highways themselves. For the next couple of years, they played and played and played hundreds of shows, honing their chops as one of America's most riveting live bands, as well as transforming their sound, marking the band's evolution to their next step. By the end of 1983, Unicorn had filed for bankruptcy, and with the band free of their legal injunction, Black Flag emerged in 1984 as a very, very different band with a very, very different look and sound. Greg Ginn had grown his hair nice and hippie length long, while, as Rollins himself attested, smoking tons of marijuana and listening to the decidedly non-punk sounds of Jimi Hendrix and the jazz fusion band the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Rollins had also grown his hair to shoulder length, became an avid weightlifter, probably to fend off the band's aggressive and violent fans in the front rows of their shows, got a bunch of tattoos, and musically became influenced by the skewered art pop and goth rock styles of Diamanda Galas and Nick Cave. They released 3 albums in '84, each one very different to the other. First was My War, a record where, especially in the second half, the band unleashed slow, monolithic, sludgy, heavier than heavy dirges that owed more to Black Sabbath than the Ramones. It perplexed fans and critics alike, but in a few short years it was seen to be a huge touchstone for the punk metal fusion known as the grunge movement that took shape in Seattle, one that would alter the entire rock landscape in the future. Listen to this album and you can hear the seeds of the Melvins, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden. More interesting, however, were the 2 albums that followed, both in '84. Family Man, with its notorious album cover of a father who seemingly decapitated his wife, beat his daughter, and is about to shoot himself in the head, is a split album, with the first half consisting of Henry Rollins' spoken word performances and poetry readings, often dark and disturbing as hell, and the second half consisting of all instrumental performances, serving as a platform for how far Black Flag had come along as musicians of a unique inventiveness. The revved up instrumentals, shifting rhythms, and oddly modal guitar riffs and solos were bluesy in feel and jazzy in their expansiveness, very much sounding like an aggressive, punked out hybrid of Jimi Hendrix and the Mahavishnu Orchestra's guitar whiz John McLaughlin. The third album of this 1984 trilogy was the powerful Slip It In, with its scandalous cover of a Catholic nun stroking a naked man's leg. Ginn wrote all the music, but Rollins started to leverage his increasingly high profile in the band by co-writing half of the lyrics. On this album, Black Flag took the metal influence of My War away from the grind of slow sludge into slightly more orthodox, faster, more aggressive metal, but offset in a good way by the band's patented, gnarly, angst-ridden punk rock. It's the album that contains, in my opinion, Ginn's most explosive guitar work, where he really nailed the midpoint between heavy metal grandiosity and punk fury and economy. The band continued to be prolific, but with dwindling results in 1985. They released 2 albums of unabashed heavy metal, Loose Nut and In My Head, where the delicate punk metal balance tilted away more to the latter, and not just that, but to the latter in a way that sounded like Iron Maiden learning what punk rock was from a children's coloring book, with a raving lunatic screaming on top of it. Much, much better and much, much more inventive was the 4-track EP, The Process of Weeding Out, an all-instrumental record. On it, Black Flag and Greg Ginn in general practically invent jazz punk fusion, a subgenre that few artists would embark on in the future, and even less with this much skill. Ginn's guitar work is glorious in the sense that he takes an approach of guitar soloing much akin to Miles Davis's philosophy on his masterpiece Kind of Blue, where instead of soloing to chord progressions, the solos are based on modal scales. The EP really is on a level of sophistication and innovation that punk rock in the 1980s, or in any decade, rarely achieved. Despite the inconsistencies in Black Flag's catalog, the high points are among the highest punk rock ever achieved, not just for their music, but for their obstinate insistence on independent DIY values of authenticity and anti-establishmentarianism that paved the way for punk rock idealism, uncompromising artistic originality, and, along with Fugazi and Discord Records, an alternative to the ugly, greedy, over-corporatized side of capitalism that inspired, enlightened, and influenced multiple generations in the future. Chris?
Yeah, for me, it's side two of My War that really is the inspiring part of the Black Flag catalog. I mean, they went all over the place, obviously, as you described, but it's just that sludge metal that they came up with that really kind of slow, sludgy. It's like punk rock, but really, really slow down, and it's just a slow burn, Black Sabbath-y kind of thing. Like you can practically hear the Melvins being born.
Yeah.
And that side, and you can practically hear like even Green River and bands like that, getting their inspiration from that. So that to me was the most innovative thing that they had come up with and that they did. And so that's the part that's always kind of more blown me away about Black Flag's catalog. And then Damaged is a hell of a good punk record. Like I said, I think Damaged is probably their best record overall.
Yeah.
It's their best and most consistent record overall, and it's the one it's got probably Henry Rollins at his most pissed off.
Well, he was also young too. He was so young when he did that record.
Yeah, he was like what, 21 years old or something like that.
20.
So
20.
Yeah,
he was
20.
Barely out of his teens.
Yeah, and so it's Rollins at his most pissed off, and the guitars at their loudest. Not their sludgiest, but definitely their loudest. So that's the stuff I take away from Black Flag. And obviously, as they went along, and those couple years that they were kind of stuck in the wilderness doing all that touring, they became a different band, and they became fascinating. A punk band that's motivated, that's influenced by Madhavasu Orchestra,
Mahavishnu
Orchestra, which just it's just pretty fascinating if you think about it, because that band is just so friggin' proggy. They're kind of like King Crimson on less acid. It's so the fact that band was an influence on Black Flag tells you something about Greg Ginn's sensibilities. So
yeah, I mean the dude was a deadhead.
Yeah, I'm saying so good band. Obviously hugely influential, and having SST as kind of their flagship, to release all this music, really, really influential, and they've stood the test of time for sure.
Yeah. All right, next, the Minutemen. Hailing from the San Pedro, or San Pedro, if you want to say it in Spanish, neighborhood of Los Angeles, and during their lifetime recording exclusively for SST Records, the Minutemen were a trio that merged funk rhythms, jazzy syncopations, jagged guitars, and fiercely political lyrics to create a wholly unique and innovative sound that set them completely apart from the usually macho, super aggro punk bands that dominated the underground LA scene in the first half of the 1980s. Injecting large doses of funk and political messaging into punk, or even post-punk rock, wasn't new to bands in the UK, as Gang of Four, the pop group, and most famously The Clash could attest to. But the Minutemen took a different tack. Their punk-funk mix had more musical sophistication, with George Hurley's jazz-trained chops providing a frantic yet controlled rhythmic pulse that resembled Captain Beefheart's avant-garde take on blues rock, but on amphetamines. Guitarist and vocalist D. Boone had a scratchy, choppy sound that belied an underrated virtuosic complexity to both his chords and his solos, something based on early 1970s funk guitar on the low end and the noisy, treble-heavy stabs of Gang of Four's Andy Gill on top. Mike Watt's busy bass fills fluttering up and down the fret somehow coaxed an irresistible danceability out of the band's sonic mix. Boone's arch-leftist political lyrics and humorous socio-cultural commentary didn't come from upper-middle-class art school origins as most of the British punkers' lyrics did. Instead, Boone's leftist political leanings, while informed by a voracious reading habit, came from a decidedly working-class perspective that gave his words a relatable warmth and tilted his message with an offbeat humor that made said message go down easily. Throw in the fact that their songs rarely went past the 1 minute mark, hence the band's name, and the result was an overall package of sound that made the Minutemen one of the most original, influential, and important bands to come out of Los Angeles in the 1980s, mainstream or underground. After releasing a couple of super short EPs in 1980 and 81, respectively, they put out their debut album, The Punchline, in late 1981. Their method of making the record reflected the band's working-class, cost-saving sensibilities to the core. Recorded in exactly 1 day during a late-night session when studio recording time was at its cheapest, using previously used tape, and the songs recorded completely live in the studio exactly in the order they appear on record. Oh yeah, and the album is 18 songs in 15 minutes. Now that's economical. The album itself is terrific. For its time, a thrillingly original and innovative mix of punk energy, funk grooves and rhythms, and jazzy musicality and sensibility. Boone's political attack and his lyrics were still rather abstract and impressionistic at this point, but it would change into something clearer and more pointed as the band evolved. Like Black Flag and the other SST label bands, the Minutemen were touring machines and road warriors. Early on, they were out of step and ill-fitted with the aggressive, knuckle-headed hardcore punk audiences they played in front of. But over time, word of mouth about this uniquely brilliant band spread, and combined with increasing critical praise in independent fanzines, they fostered their own following and fan base that was more eclectic and intellectually compatible. By the time of their 1983 album, What Makes a Man Start Fires, they were a genuine buzzworthy band in the American underground. The album itself was a leap forward in that there were, heaven forbid, a few songs that actually reached the 2.5 minute mark. Again recorded in one late night session, but this time 2 other late night sessions were held for some overdubs. Ooh, professionalism. What makes this album distinct from their whirling dervish of a debut is how deeply bass-driven it is, reflecting how bassist Mike Watt wrote all the music, for this record, and the slower tempos that reveal a growth in songwriting prowess, featuring actual vocal melodies and incessantly catchy, hooky guitar lines. D. Boone's affecting combination of leftist politics and offbeat humor in his lyrics start to acquire a clearer, more direct, and more distinct appeal to working class activism, fitting for a guy who grew up admiring Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan. See the endearing tribute track, Bob Dylan Wrote Propaganda Songs. The following year saw the release of their iconic masterpiece, 1984's Double Nickels on the Dime. This double album saw the band's appeal transcend their roots in the indie hardcore scene and reach mainstream music critics as well as the playlists of college radio stations. It's easy to see why. The album consolidates everything that was so endearing and great about the Minutemen, the punk-funk jazz fusion, the astute political commentary and messaging, the working class empathy, the goofball flippant humor, into an expertly crafted package of super tight, brilliantly arranged songs with earworm guitar riffs, bass grooves, melodies, and memorable lyrics. If you only had to listen to one Minutemen album, this would be the one. Just when their profile was rising, the band's creative juices started to falter. Their final album, 1985's Three-Way Tie for Last, saw D. Boone write only 4 of the 16 songs, while Mike Watt wrote 7, but all with outside contributors. The Minutemen had already started to include covers on their albums. Double Nickels on the Dime had groovy covers of tracks by Creedence Clearwater Revival and Steely Dan, but Three-Way Tie for Last was a little too reliant on underdeveloped and misguided covers of songs by Blue Oyster Cult, Rocky Erickson of the 13th Floor Elevators, the Meat Puppets, the Urinals, and, again, CCR and Steely Dan. But more troubling is how the band sounded watered down into something more conventional and drab, something approaching a poorly produced 1980s take on 1960s folk rock. The sharp socio-political commentary in the lyrics that was colored by quirky humor and working class relatability had now transformed to awkwardly phrased, over-the-top Phil Oakes style protest that frankly was overbearing and preachy, something no one would have ever associated with the Minutemen. Unfortunately, the band never had a chance to make a comeback record. In late 1985, just after the Minutemen had committed to do a tour opening for REM the following year, D. Boon died in a tragic van accident, and the band quickly dissolved afterward. But man, oh man, what a legacy this band left behind. Their thrillingly original sound, unaffected personas, and lyrical righteousness left an indelible mark on American alternative and indie rock for multiple generations and decades. The Red Hot Chili Peppers, Sublime, Uncle Tupelo, half of which would branch off into Wilco, Jeff Mangum of Neutral Milk Hotel, The National, Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, all have gone on record expressing the impact and influence of the Minutemen in some form or other on their work. If anything, with the current cultural and political situation in America, the Minutemen are a band that need to be remembered now more than ever. Chris?
Yeah, fun band, aptly named, as you said, the Minutemen. You know, their songs rarely went over 2 minutes. Just in, out, you know, come together, put together some really great pop structures. Mike Watt was a hell of a bass player, you know, just really, really gifted bass player, actually. And he was definitely the driving force behind a lot of the songs. The drumming was also really killer in a lot of ways. And they have one of my favorite covers by anybody when they did Dr. Wu
Steely Dan.
From Steely Dan. Is he just an ordinary guy? You know, it's just kind of speak singing it as they go along. And I love Double Nickels on the Dime because it never gets boring, and it's 42 songs in 74 minutes. Seriously, if you have an hour and 15 minutes to invest, folks, you should listen to this record because it is wacky, but it's controlled, but often it's poignant in some spots. It's strangely poignant. Like the longer it goes on, the more poignant it gets, even though it's got some goofy song titles all the way through it.
Political song for Michael Jackson to sing.
Yep.
That's one of my favorites.
There's a lot in that vein that's really, really good. But again, you know, D. Boon, deceptively good rock singer. Mike Watt, one of the best bassists of his era. And yeah, just really, really good stuff. And it's just indelible. You can see the influence of Gang of Four, but you can see the influence that they had on, like you said, Red Hot Chili Peppers and Pearl Jam and all of that. And I remember Mike Watt did a solo record in 1994 that had a lot of guest players on it and kind of blew up. And so he had his MTV 120 minutes moment.
Yep. I mean, Jeff Tweedy from Wilco once said in an interview, when Uncle Tupelo started, that was the band Tweedy was in before Wilco. When Uncle Tupelo started, man, we were just trying to do like the Minutemen doing country music. That's basically what he said, you know.
That's a pretty good description of early Uncle Tupelo too. So yeah, great band. Great band.
All right. Next, X. X were truly one of the seminal, most notable bands of the Los Angeles punk scene in the 1980s, and arguably the most consistently critically acclaimed. The thing with X, though, is that they didn't really fit in with the hardcore punks or the other misfit bands that made up LA's underground scene. The reason is that their brand of punk was actually quite orthodox in that it was heavily indebted to classic 1950s rock and roll and rockabilly, occasionally even drifting into country and folk music. In addition, their lyrics were hyper-literate with a poetic, dreamy quality that often conveyed narratives of lost romantic souls in a lost, utterly unsympathetic world. In that sense, much like their music harkened back to the energy rush of the 1950s, and 1950s early rock music, their lyricism evoked the soulful desperation of the 1950s beat poets. Their two lead singers and, at the time, married partners bassist John Doe and Exene Cervenka, wrote the bulk of their songs, and they struck a commanding, charismatic presence on stage. In their original lifetime from 1980 to 93, they released 7 albums, but it's their first two, 1980's Los Angeles and 1981's Wild Gift, that are generally acknowledged as their greatest work, with classic tracks such as Johnny Hit and Run Pauline, The World's a Mess, It's in My Kiss, We're Desperate, and White Girl. Me, I much prefer their fourth album, 1983's More Fun in the New World, which saw their lyrics get away from their usual personal dramas and more into social issues and sly anti-Reagan political commentary. Musically, they also let their hair down and embrace different styles such as funk and soul. Chris?
Yeah, a good band. The rockabilly influence is definitely pretty clear on those first 2 records. You didn't mention that Ray Manzarek was
Oh
the
yeah, I should have
producer
mentioned that. Yeah,
of their first record.
the first 5 records.
The first 5 records.
He produced 80. Yeah, he produced their first 4 records were produced by Ray Manzarek of the Doors.
Yep. So the fact that Ray Manzarek was able to channel his sensibilities into a punk band,
and he discovered them too.
Yep.
Discovered them too. Yeah.
Yeah, and just so you had Exene Cervenka, who was a legit poet. She was a poet before she was a rock star.
Right.
And she came to the band with a poet sensibility, and the fact that they had those 50s kind of suave cat influences that came into their music was really, really strong. And it was interesting to see how they evolved, between 1980 and 1993. But by the end, they were more of a country. I guess you could call them country punk.
Yeah.
And
they were really big. They were getting big into rockabilly too.
Yeah, and it was all really compelling. I mean, I to me, those first 2 albums, like Los Angeles is a classic, but they got more interesting as they went along. They got quirkier and more interesting, and it's interesting that they didn't get bigger because, again, I think their music had more commercial potential than some of these other bands too.
Sure, I agree with that.
They were songier in some respects and more orthodox. Their songs were 4 minutes long, and they weren't gimmicky, and they were straightforward chugga lugga type songs. And so it's interesting that they didn't get bigger. But hey, more power to John Doe and Exene Cervenka. They really came up with something special.
Yeah. Next, and finally, the Gun Club. For younger generations of rock music fans, or just for those with modern ears and sensibilities, the idea of merging blues and punk rock isn't such a novel concept, thanks to bands such as the White Stripes and the Black Keys. Well, at least early Black Keys. But in the early 1980s, the Gun Club shook the Los Angeles music scene by doing exactly that, startling the underground punk scene and leaving an impression on the mainstream aspiring Sunset Strip scene. Seriously, Axl Rose must have noticed or known about this band. He practically stole his gutter fabulous, dirty glam rocker look of Guns N' Roses' early days from Jeffrey Lee Pierce. Speaking of Pierce, he was the Gun Club's singer, songwriter, and driving force, the only consistent and constant member during their 7-album run from 1981 to 93. However, Pierce's heroin addiction and alcoholism started to take a toll on him from the mid-80s onward, resulting in a recorded output that was uneven at best and live shows that ranged from a shambolic mess to an uplifting, glorious experience of transcendent rock and roll. Nevertheless, like with the band X, it's in the Gun Club's first 2 albums that their reputation and place in rock history is staked. The 1981 debut album, Fire of Love, sounds exactly like you would imagine if you merged the heavy, soulful, echo-laden, crisp production of all the blues records made in Chicago's Chess Records in the late 1940s, early 1950s, with the relentless energy, crackle, and wild bohemian decadent spirit of New York's CBGB's punk scene of the mid-1970s. Jeffrey Lee Pierce himself sounds like a combination of a wild shaman and a tortured old blues man from the Mississippi Delta. Songs like Sex Beat, She's Like Heroin to Me, and For the Love of Ivy are unlike anything any band or artist in LA or the country in general were doing at the time, sounding both strikingly familiar in its blues roots, but refreshingly new in its presentation. The follow-up album, 1982's Miami, has a fuller, more fleshed out production courtesy of Blondie guitarist Chris Stein, who produced it. A healthy dose of psychedelia a la Dr. John's Cajun Voodoo appears in the eerie, haunting Watermelon Man. Visceral, turbocharged blues punk is still present, with Like Calling Up Thunder and Bad Indian, while the band's cover of Creedence Clearwater Revival's Run Through the Jungle manages to rock harder without losing any of the original's foreboding menace. Fun anecdote, Billy Idol once said he met Jeffrey Lee Pierce at an LA bar around this time, the making of Miami, and based his song and soon-to-be smash hit White Wedding on Miami's closing track, Mother of Earth. How about that, Chris?
How about that? Yeah. Yeah, seriously, how about that? With this band, it's all about, to me, it's all about Fire of Love. I think that's a really standout album and a really and For the Love of Ivy is the standout track on that. I know that Jack White is on record as saying that Fire of Love is a huge influence on him.
Yeah, you can hear it.
Yeah, and he's said that, this is the type of album that they ought to teach in schools. An actual quote from him. And so Jeffrey Lee Pierce, definitely a character, definitely had that kind of punk iconoclasm to him. And, obviously had the drug issues, which, kind of shortened his shelf life. But, I could see why this band was definitely influential. And they're kind of like X in the sense that some of their music, there was more bluesy, but there was some rockabilly, a little bit of rockabilly that
rockabilly.
Rockabilly, baby.
I like rockabilly though.
Rockabilly, baby. It kind of snuck into the mix a little bit, and so made for a fabulous record. Miami's pretty good, not as good as Fire of Love, and I can see why you would include them as being seminal to the LA thing, because the LA thing, again, it had the punk rock sensibility, but it had this eclecticism to it as well,
right?
Where you had country and you had rockabilly, and you had some of those earlier forms that kind of helped shape and mold it into something that was a little bit more musically challenging. And it's the same thing with the Minutemen. I mean, the Minutemen, they dabbled in jazz a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, so there's a unity between all these bands that you mentioned. And I can imagine that scene being really exciting because, these bands were so creative and had such a broad vocabulary of rock and roll that they infused into their punk. And so the Gun Club was definitely part of that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So we've come to the end of this part one of this LA rock series. Our next episode will cover the period of 1986 to 90. And that'll be fun. There's a lot to cover there. More hair metal, baby.
That's where things get truly interesting and things get truly more sort of get into the mainstream. Things got a little out of control during that period, at least on the glam metal side.
For sure.
Yeah.
So Chris, sail us out. Sail us away.
So sail away, come sail away with us. Okay. On that note, folks, as we always do at the end of these episodes, if you're a Styx fan, you'll especially love being in our Curmudgeonly community. Our Curmudgeonly community is a Facebook page that we've been running for the last couple of years. And we have lots of good material that we come up with there, where we generally preview these episodes. Art will dazzle you with the depth of his YouTube coffers, and so definitely join us there at Curmudgeon Rock at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. If you have any thoughts, if you have any hate mail that you want to send us or any fan mail you want to send us, you can send us submissive at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And remember that we will have a Spotify playlist, as we've been doing for the last year and a half. We'll have a Spotify playlist dedicated to the music that we talked about in this episode. So if you want to check out I might just put the entirety of Double Nickels on a Dime in that playlist. You know, why not? And maybe the entirety of Shout at the Devil. We'll see.
God.
But you'll see that. So you'll be able to access that via a link in the episode description wherever you're accessing this podcast. Whether it's on Stitcher or Apple or Amazon, you'll be able to access this playlist and enjoy all of this music of the LA rock and roll scene of the 1980s, the early 1980s. And so with that, we come to the end of this episode. We hope that you have an excellent couple of weeks, and come back and join us for the rest of the LA story in 2 weeks, baby.